So today we're going to be in James chapter 3, but before we get there, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever felt like you were smart? Have you ever felt like you were wise? Maybe if I had a 2-year-old I could say that, but you know, after that then it starts feeling like sliding behind. But the idea of wisdom, being wise about something, where does it come from? What does it mean? And by what standard are we judging it? Solomon was known as the wisest man to ever live. And based on some of the statements that I heard, that I can read about him, I would say he was definitely a lot smarter than I ever was. I have been or will be. But wisdom, where does it come from? And how do we judge it? In James chapter 3, and starting with verse 13, it says, "Who is wise and understanding among you?" I think if you'll notice, this is kind of a trap question, a trick question here. Who is wise and understanding among you? Just like I asked you a moment ago, you know, who considers themselves to be smart? Whenever you ask the question, who considers themselves to be wisdom? Who among you considers yourself wise and understanding? He says, let him show it. Okay? How are you going to show your wisdom? Well, it wasn't what I thought was going to come next. Because what comes next is let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. Now wait a minute. Wise, wisdom, and humility. Do they usually go together? When you're speaking of earthly wisdom, they don't generally go together. Because the people who believe themselves to be wise in the eyes of the world would also be proud and think of themselves highly. I love the story that Ian shared with us this morning. That really hit my heart when he was sharing that. He had shared it with me the other day, and I told him, I said, man, that'd make a good communion talk. But he really did a good job of sharing that, and I guess I have eaten a little bit too much before bedtime too, so I recognize that side of it as well. But the idea that in wisdom, sometimes we do. If we're talking about earthly wisdom, it brings about pride. But what about godly wisdom? The title on my section, this verses 13 through 18, it says 2 kinds of wisdom. When you think about wisdom, what do you think of? And what does the world think of as wisdom? When I was working at Microsoft, I quickly learned that you never would be the top of the chain. I could never get smart enough. I could never know enough about computers. As a matter of fact, before I went, I thought I knew quite a bit about computers, and I thought I was pretty smart. And then I went there and I started realizing that, man, I don't even know anything compared to these guys. But you know, 10 years later, I still didn't know anything about computers. It was amazing to me that there was always people smarter than me and ahead of me. But that's, again, earthly wisdom. The godly wisdom comes, and according to this, in connection with humility. Like Ian was sharing earlier, it's not always what we would think. It's not always what we would maybe perceive. But when we do God's wisdom, when we work under His wisdom, what kind of things happen? What kind of things can come about? One of my favorite, here I go again. One of my favorite stories in the Bible is a story of Gideon. When I think about Gideon, I always think of this great leader. But you know, when you start reading about it, you know what he was doing when the angel came to speak to him? He comes to him and he's hiding in a wine press, and he's grinding grain. Why is he down in the wine press grinding grain? so that the enemy can't see them. The Midianites had come in and stole all of their stuff, burned their crops, taken their animals, and they had nothing left. So he was down in a wine press, grinding his wheat so that he could make some bread. And the angel comes to him and he says, "O mighty warrior." And Gideon says, "Who are you talking to?" Because he's down here hiding. But not just that. He says, "I am the least in my clan," which is the least of all of the clans. "And you're calling me mighty?" And he says to him, he says, "I want you to lead my people. They have cried out to me because of the Midianites who are coming in and raiding your lands." You see, once again, the Israelites had gone against God's will and had begun to worship the gods of the people of this land that they lived in. And they began to worship the Asherah pole and Baal. And they were worshiping these gods, and God allows them to be taken over by the enemy. And as they begin to be taken over by the enemy, of course, they cry out to God, and God comes to their rescue. So he says, "Gather all of the fighting men together." So Gideon does that. He gathers all the fighting men together, says, "Meet me at this spot." So they come together, and there's 32,000 men that come together. But he had just told us in a few verses earlier that the enemies, the Midianite, was so large that they couldn't even be counted. So the Gideon is told to gather these men together in 32,000. Well, they're probably estimating 4 to 1. So the enemy is probably at least 4 times greater than them. But God says, "You have too many people. You have too many men." And Gideon says, "What do you mean? We've only got a 4th amount as the enemy does." And he says, "No." He said, tell you what. Let the Israelites know that if there are anyone who's afraid, go ahead and go home." And I can imagine Gideon questioning this, but going ahead and doing it. And as he does this, the men just started getting up and walking off. Not just 1 or 2, not hundreds, thousands. Of the 32,000, 22,000 of them leave. And they are left with 10,000 men. And Gideon said, "Man, I don't know how you're going to do this, God." And he says, "You have too many men." And Gideon says, "Say what?" He says, "You have too many men still." He says, "Okay, take them down to the water. And anyone that gets down on their hands and knees and laps the water, send them home. But those that pick the water up and lap it out of their hands, keep them." 9,700 men got down on their hands and knees and lapped the water. He's left with 300 men. And it says the Midianites moved into this valley. And along with them, all of the neighboring enemies as well joined him. It says there were so many that they could not even be counted. They were more numerous than the sands of the sea. And so Gideon says to God, says, "If this is really you, could you show me a sign?" And God shows him a sign. And he says, "If this is really you, could you show me the sign the opposite way?" And he shows him the sign the opposite way. And Gideon says, "Okay, I know I can trust you." But he must have still been shaking in his boots, because God says to him, he says, "I want you to go down, take your servant, go down to the edge of the camp of the Midianites. If you have any fear at all, just go down there and listen." So he takes his servant and they go down there, and just like the dream that we heard about a minute ago, they go down and they're listening. And the first thing he hears when he comes up is one of the Midianites saying to another one, "Man, last night I had this dream. There was this huge loaf of bread that rolls into camp and plows over the camp. And the other guy says, oh, that's the Israelites coming to destroy us. And when Gideon heard this, he said, God has given him into our hands. So he goes back and he follows God's instructions. He takes his 300 men and all of the trumpets and the pitchers and the torches, and they surround. They separate into 3 groups, and they go around and they surround the valley where the enemy is. And he blows the trumpet, and he breaks the jars, and the torches shine, and they shout for God and for Gideon. I think that's what it says. Is that what it says, Darren? And he says, for God and for Gideon. And all of a sudden, the enemy turns against himself, and the whole armies, all of the armies, turn against each other and are destroyed. A few of them escape, and they chase them down and destroy them as well. Why did God choose to do that? If he had asked me my opinion, I would not have sent home the 22,000 men. I wouldn't have sent home the next 9,700 men. I wouldn't have left myself with just 300 men. As a matter of fact, if I was God, I would have rallied bigger armies. But God did it for one reason: to show them that it wasn't them. Humility. The wisdom of God and humility go hand in hand. I can't believe that Ian told that story this morning, because it goes just perfectly with my lesson. And he didn't know what I was preaching about, did you? Yeah, I didn't think so. And Darren sharing the communion talk, I thought was perfect too. It just goes right together. And then you ask yourself, I wonder how that just happens like that, you know? Maybe there is a God, huh? But I want to go back to James chapter 3. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. So now we're going to flip and we're going to look at the other side. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambitions in your hearts, what would you consider to be bitter envy and selfish ambition? I had to stop and think about this because, you know, I don't know, like a lot of times when I'm reading through His Word, I'll read it, and I've read it 100 times before, and so I just read over it. But I decided to stop and think about it. This is a good idea, by the way. Stop and think about what God was trying to say here, what the writer of James is sharing with us. And he says, bitter envy. What is bitter envy? I had to think about it for a while. And what I came back with was, well, if you were looking at other people and seeing what great things they had, and you didn't have them, you might become bitter about it. And you might envy what they had and want what they had. So the bitter envy could be jealousy. It could be feeling like, why isn't God blessing me? It might be feelings of despair. I'll never have those things that they have. Whatever those bitter envy thoughts were, he says, that is the opposite of wisdom. And he says, if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition, once again, selfish ambition, what is this? When we have ambition, that's not a bad thing. But when we have selfish ambition, when our desires is to fulfill what we want, when we're working towards and seeking all of the things that we want, then it becomes selfish. It becomes self-centered. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we learned about in our counseling stuff is that self-centeredness, when you become overly self-centered or completely focused on yourself, they call that narcissism. So when we become self-focused to the point where our ambition is all about ourselves, climbing the ladder, stepping on whoever we have to get there, that is the selfish ambition that he's talking about. So once again, let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom, in quotes here, does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice. I was thinking about different Bible stories and how do we find the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of the world. And I thought about it for a little bit, and I thought, well, if I had been standing next to God and he said to me, he says, what do you think I should do in this situation? There's this man who's going around and persecuting all of my people. He's throwing them in prison. He's chasing them out of their homes. He's killing them. What should I do with this man? I think I probably would have sided with the sons of thunder, or maybe with Ananias, and said, you can't trust this man. But God, he sends him a message. He blinds him on the road to Damascus and says, I want you to be my servant. I want you to take the gospel message to the Gentiles. That wouldn't have been my suggestion if I was standing next to God. Or what about whenever there's the man who is preaching the gospel and teaching to the lost, and men begin to pick up rocks and they begin to stone this man. And God says, what do you think I should do? Well, stop him. Don't let him kill him. I mean, he's preaching the good news. Reward him. Don't let him die. But instead, he is stoned to death. And the gospel is carried throughout all of the known world. So the question is, how do we know God's wisdom? Because if I was judging it by my own wisdom, I wouldn't have come to the same conclusions. I would have had different ideas. So whenever he asks, what would you do in this situation? Mine isn't going to be the same. And you're going to say to yourself, well, that's not quite fair because, you don't know all of the things God knows. Exactly. My wisdom isn't going to be God's wisdom because I don't know what he knows. I don't know the hearts of men. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I don't know that pulling a man who is converting people like crazy and transferring him to another location where he's going to meet a single man in a chariot. I have no idea. I still don't know what happened after that. But I do believe that God had a purpose. And I have a funny feeling that that man went back and spread in his hometown all around about this Jesus. But that wouldn't have been the way I would have chose to do it. God knows the future. God knows the hearts of men. God knows these things. So how can I tap into his wisdom? Let's read on. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. I would not have written that list. Would you? If somebody had asked you to describe wisdom, would you have written that list? Start with the first one. Pure. Wisdom and purity. From my eyes, I would not have chosen the word pure to describe wisdom. But he says, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure. It's not selfish ambition. It's not this envy, bitter envy. It's not selfish, but rather pure and holy. Purity is of God. Then peace-loving. This word peace-loving, it doesn't necessarily mean that you never have disagreements with people, that you have to do whatever everybody else says to do. That's not the idea of it. Peace-loving is somebody that loves peace, that desires that's their goal. Doesn't mean you're not going to have conflicts, that you're not going to find people that are disagreeing with you. It means that your desire, your hope is for peace. I think sometimes we go the opposite way with that, and we try to convince everybody that Christians should never have conflicts, that Christians should never go against the government or anybody else, that we should do whatever everybody says, that's the idea. But that's not what he's portraying here. This idea of being of a pure heart and to be peace-loving is someone who is desiring God's will over their own, and that they are doing whatever they can to enjoy the peace. Not that they would just necessarily give up all rights. But the next thing he says is considerate. When he talks about being considerate, you consider other people. You put other people first. The next word, submissive. The ideas go together. That when we are considerate of someone else's needs, when we put someone else's thoughts or ideas before my own, again, there's the opposite of what we were saying before, that's self-seeking. If we're not self-seeking, we're putting others before ourselves. We're considerate to others, and we're submissive. We're being submissive to God. We're being submissive to His will and following Him. In Ephesians chapter 5, he talks about the submissiveness. Submit to one another as to the Lord. Wives, submit to your husbands. All of these things that they talk about there. Submitting to one another, being considerate and as to God. Here he also says, full of mercy. When you think about mercy, when you think about being merciful to someone, God is more merciful than anyone could ever compete with. We can't be as merciful as he was, as he is. But his desire is to be like him, to have mercy on one another, to not judge them harshly, to not be unfair with them, but to be merciful and to give grace to them. The next part is to be good fruit, impartial, and sincere. All of these things describe a believer, someone who is putting God's wisdom ahead of his own. Like I said before, if God had asked me to stand beside him and make judgments, my judgments wouldn't have been the same as his, because I do not have all of these things that he asks me to have. It's not a matter of us being perfect in this. It's not a matter of us having all of this perfectly, being pure as he is, but that's our goal. That's what our aim is. So when we talk about what is wisdom and how do we compare to it, what do we use as our standard? God is our standard. We know we can't be that way. We know we can't be perfect as he is perfect, pure as he is pure. But that's our goal. That's what we're striving for. That's what he wants us to work towards. In verse 18, he says, peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. When we are striving to be like God, to use his wisdom over ours, we are bringing peace to that situation. And he says that when we are sowing peace, when we are peacemakers and sowing that peace, the result of that, the fruit that comes out of that, is righteousness. Being right in God's eyes. That's what he's asking us to do. Last chapter, it talked about the idea of faith and deeds, putting our faith and our deeds together. And I believe that's what he's coming back to here, is the idea that he wants us to have our faith, believe, trust in God, and put it to work. Wisdom. How can we put our wisdom to work? He talks about the wisdom here as being doing his will. To have wisdom that comes from heaven is, first of all, pure, peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy, and good fruit, impartial, and sincere. He wants us to plant those seeds, to be that kind of a Christian, be that believer, so that the result will be righteousness. Sometimes we see that word righteous, that we are righteous, and we think that we are pious, we're above, that we're better than everyone else. And that's not it at all. Going back to the beginning, he talks about humility and wisdom being together. It's his wisdom, not mine. I have no right to have pride, to feel proud about what I've accomplished. And the stories that I shared, it's God who was working in those. Gideon didn't have much to do with it. He just did what God told him to do, used his wisdom.